Hello, it's Tuesday around 10 a.m., which means it's time for another installment of Composition 2, Section 3004. As always, I am your instructor, Mr. Fowler, and I'm so happy that you've joined me today. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm not going to wait. Let's go ahead and start with a share screen. And here we are for Fall 2020 Composition 2, English 104, in other words, and Section 3004. We meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, don't forget, and I'll usually upload links on every Tuesday and Thursday morning. So for Session 5, in terms of our preview, I want to talk a little bit today about visual arguments. This week we'll be beginning the discussion that will lead into next week's writing lab, where we will begin to compose the ad analysis. Now, one of those days next week, that Monday, will be a holiday. It'll be Labor Day holiday, but we probably will have 2 posted meetings anyway, since we meet on Tuesday, Thursday, and that is a Monday meeting day, just to be aware. So I'll probably still post 2 videos that week. So again, thinking critically. How do we think critically about a visual argument? We'll find out today. What do active reading strategies, you read that correctly, what do active reading strategies have to do with visuals? How is it possible to highlight and annotate a visual? Then we'll talk about some ideas for a critical response to visuals, much akin to the way we ended last week's chapter with a critical response and how to write that. And then I'll leave you with some time to think about a checklist that appears on pages 94 to 95 of your text. This is a really good way to sort of potentially structure another form of outline that you could use in order to make your paper come to life. We'll have some time left over for Q&A if there are questions or concerns. And then I want you to spend a few minutes this week, just 15 minutes out of your entire week, to tackle the weekly discussion thread. So again, for our discussion thread for today, or this week rather, weekly discussion number 3 is up and posted. Oh, maybe it's not up and posted. That's okay. It will be up and posted, but weekly discussion thread number 3 looks like this. I'll just show you what it looks like. It will look the exact same as yours. And it's essentially just this. For 15 minutes, I want you to free write to reflect on these questions. What topic or example are you thinking about writing on for the ad analysis? What do you still need more information about after discussing this topic in the forums and reaching out to me vis-a-vis email? And then what concerns do you have about this project in terms of how you'll be evaluated? So those are the basics for this week. Okay, let's review a little bit. Last week during sessions 3 and 4, we talked a little bit about thinking and reading critically. Specifically, we suggested that when you construct any kind of critical response, that you begin very generally by assessing the accuracy of your author. Most basic academic arguments ask you to take up a position that a writer has already written about in order to either agree with or disagree with their perspective. Traditionally, I like to refer to these ideas of agreement as a yes and, or disagreement as a yes but type of thesis statement. All that means really is that when you say yes and, you're agreeing with your author's perspective and adding or reinforcing their initial argument. When you argue a yes but, you admit that there are strong points that your author is making. However, you seem to have come to the conclusion that they missed an important element, or maybe there was a perspective that they should have considered more thoroughly. In this case, you would adopt a yes but perspective. Then you should summarize their key position. What is it that you want your audience to understand about this argument? What are the key factors and supporting elements that your author or that your position is taking up? Evaluate the effectiveness of the original author's support. Look for weaknesses and potential areas where thought may have evolved, or new information or technology may play a role in changing your audience's perspective. Then pause long enough to consider the validity of opposing arguments. If there are good points, it's always a nice idea to admit that your opponent has made some good observations. And this buys you some credibility with your audience, because you come out looking like a better, more well-rounded, more well-read commentator. And it brings a thoroughness and fullness to the scope of your argument. Whereas if you simply ignore other ideas to avoid the problems that they bring to your own perspective, your audience will see you as biased or motivated more out of a sense of duty or out of a sense of emotional support that's lent to one of these concepts, versus the more important version, which is putting your argument out there with logical, thoroughly researched information. Remember to focus on the key points of your argument's opposing perspective, and then look for, again, things that are unconvincing, have been poorly stated, or are even irrelevant. Okay, so that's just a brief review of what we discussed last time. Now today, we want to spend a little bit of time thinking about visual arguments. And as your textbook explains in chapter 3, visual arguments are very similar to the kinds of arguments that you get to construct in a written format. And the ways in which they can be read are very similar to the ways a traditional textual argument could be read and deconstructed in a critical perspective. So let's begin real quickly in your text by looking at a couple of these examples. All of the examples I'm going to pull from today are from your textbook, Practical Argument. So one of the things that they said early on is that all of the traditional appeals, pathos, logos, and ethos, are still relevant to a visual argument, right? Here's an illustration which makes a strong visual argument according to the authors of your text, using the image of a young child holding a mutilated teddy bear to make an emotional appeal to those concerned about exposure to television violence. You can see that there from your textbook. You can use your active reading strategies to diagnose such a visual. And our authors do this a little bit for us. The visual on the previous page includes 3 dominant images: the child, the teddy bear, and the giant screen TV, projecting the image of a hand holding a knife. The placement of the child in the center, with the teddy bear on the side and the knife on the other, suggests the child, and by extension all children, are caught between the violence of childhood and the violence depicted in the media. Okay, so you can see this child appears to be a young man, is centered, and you've got the mutilated teddy bear over here on this side, and you've got the television violence on the side where his arm disappears behind the television. And so you've got this idea that the fuzziness of reality is indicated by this background, kind of a background TV static. Blurs the lines of reality and blurs the lines of fantasy. So the purpose of this chapter, with all of the various examples that the authors are choosing to use as illustrations of how this phenomenon unfolds visually, are geared to express just how much visual awareness you already have about this particular topic. So let's start with another example, and I'm going to walk you through. And this is an example of an ad from the Grand Theft Auto video game series. And as you can see, there are a number of constituent elements. But specifically, I want to deal with 4 in this analysis. I want to deal with the foreground, the background, any and all text that appears within the advertisement, and the context in which this game is being introduced. Okay, so right away, let's look at the foreground. We have the central protagonist in the foreground, and by framing him in the foreground, we can see that he actually appears as large as, if not larger than, the city. We get a version of the Empire State Building back here, a traditional New York landmark that once boasted the position of the world's highest building. And when the protagonist carries his gun or lets his gun rest on his shoulder, the barrel of the gun extends his presence visually as being almost as large as, if not a little bit larger than, the city. Now, truly, he's not a giant character if you've never played this game or anything. He's a regular man, but he's standing on a high precipice looking over the city. The city, of course, is suggested to be New York, as it has several famous New York landmarks that can be easily identified through the haze, despite the fact that it's actually called Liberty City. In the extreme background, we have that city highlighted, but the other thing about this visual is that the city is kind of depicted under a yellow or smoky haze. Okay, pollution probably that gives us a sense of time and place. This is clearly 21st century New York, and it's a contemporary look at the city. Lastly, we have the credits, or the actual text, Grand Theft Auto 4, and it's centered in a very distinct font, and it's set off by using a dual chromatic, not monochromatic, but bichromatic color scheme, black and white, set against the more realistic looking digitized images. So it's obviously meant to capture your visual appeal or your visual field, or draw it right to the center. Let's see here. I think those are all of the things your textbook references. Visually, there's also a sense that the key figure, the protagonist, might be looking down on the city from a higher point, advantage point. That gives him the sort of gigantic perspective that he has transposed against the city. So looking at just those constituent elements, you can see that you already know quite a bit about the visual field and how to read visual examples within the space of an ad or argument. Okay. I'll give you one additional example here. It's on the next page. It's called Silence the Violence. Okay. And there's not a whole lot of text to decode here. There's this bit up in the upper corner here. Let me reorient myself here. This would be in the upper left-hand corner of the ad. And I'll read that a little bit later because that text is really small. And then we have the text, Silence the Violence, written beneath this very haunting image. Now, a couple of things to note about this image. Let's start with the child themselves. We know that the child is extremely young because even though we can't tell its gender and even its race and relative age have been obscured, we can tell that it has a diaper on. So this is supposed to be a shockingly young child being exposed to television. Next, let's look at the range of weaponry that's depicted. We have some more conventional weapons from today's era, a host of guns, both automatic and non-automatic. We have explosives like grenades, really advanced weaponry like a nuclear warhead, and more traditional weaponry like old-time cartoon-like bombs, ninja weapons like these shurikens here, or throwing stars. We have a bow and arrow going way back, but I'm struck mostly by this one, the basic first weapon of mankind, the fist. And I think that's an important image because when I see that, I recall watching hours of TV westerns, old-fashioned black and white westerns, where life was pretty cheap. People could be shot, and they were each episode. If you remember a series like Have Gun Will Travel, or the Steve McQueen piece Wanted Dead or Alive, which is recently parodied in that Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in LA. The Leonardo DiCaprio character was on a show called Bounty Law, which is a direct parallel to the Steve McQueen series that actually was on television. And Steve McQueen as a character appears in that film to further solidify that connection. So those early westerns would often depict even gun violence without showing blood. You wouldn't actually see an entry or exit wound, and the events are played by for dramatics. But even if on a weekly basis you didn't see somebody getting killed in a duel, something more benign like Bonanza, which did have its share of gunplay, especially earlier on, there was a fight just about every episode. So the visual violence of the fisticuffs a lot of times is underscored, but even that type of violence can be seen as contributing to a larger sense of what acceptable violence would be included in a daily diet of TV watching or mass media enjoyment. Right around this time of the year, for the past several years on social media, I've seen a lot of posts that come up. It's the same or very similar posts reminding parents that as their young daughters start each and every school year, that they need to be aware that it's not okay if a boy, strikes them or physically abuses them or something like that. This is often played off in society as male's inability to express his affection or concern or his desire to get the attention of young girls. And the newer trend has been to suggest that's not appropriate, because over time, that idea, which may have been true to some extent, is perhaps contributing to the conditioning of young women to accept physical violence as part of their interactions with men. And there's a newer sort of rising campaign in the wake of some of the NFL's attempts to discuss domestic abuse, that maybe we need to start even younger or start even earlier. So I've seen these kinds of visual and written arguments online and social media. Obviously, there are all sorts of social visuals that are going on in mass media today, advocating for a whole host of changes or at least consideration. And I think many of these same sorts of visual components are valid. Now, a couple of things that some of my other students pointed out was the visual of this television. It's older. So the other thing that this does for us is gives us a sense of context in terms of the time and place in which the ad appears. So it is an older ad. I think on one level too, it might just be difficult to draw a flat screen television because it's rendered in 2 dimensions and it's already like a one-dimensional line. That might not be as telling perhaps as visually as the artist would intend it to be. The other thing to consider about this is that it's definitely not a computer. And I think a lot of times when we think of mass media and violence, we're getting more and more of our news and more of our media through computers, through services like YouTube and other streaming services like Peacock and Netflix and Hulu. That kind of material is coming to us oftentimes through our computers as frequently as it is through our television sets. The other piece that I find relevant here is that little text in the side, on the upper left-hand side. And it's styled in the form of a Hollywood rating format. So it's rated MV, right, and made up for media violence, as opposed to PG for parental guidance, or R for restricted, or G for general audiences, right? So as it says here, media violence, and then it says will affect your children. And this print's very small, so please bear with me. It says the American, what is it? The American Academy of Pediatrics. Wow. The American Academy of Pediatrics recognizes exposure to media, including violence in the movies, on television, in commercials, on radio, and the internet, can duly influence young children. According to the calculations of the American Society of Pediatrics, children between the ages of 2 and 18 years average 8 hours and 32 minutes each day during in terms of exposure to media. This can have an undue effect on their psychology, including the creation of nightmares and fear of personal violence being committed against them. So we also with the text that we have, get the sense that the authorship has a specific purpose, and they also deliver some statistical data to back up the general perception that media violence is perhaps arcing too high in our day-to-day lives. Last but not least, you have the theme or message of the piece: silence the violence. 3 simple words. They're not saying mass media is wrong, or an old ad going back several years now. It's 11 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? Not as complicated as any of that. Just 3 words. Silence the violence. And silence and violence have an internal rhyme scheme, which actually makes remembering this ad that much easier. You could even call it the silence the violence ad if you didn't even, we have, what is it? Nate Londa's, the author's name embedded there in our text. But if you couldn't remember Nate Londa, you could probably easily remember the silence the violence ad campaign. And if you research that, I bet within a couple of Google hits, we would find exactly that image. So we have a visual that's also very meaningful, but well designed in terms of how it's trying to get its message across. Okay, how does that help us? Well, if we look at the ad analysis rubric for next week, not next time, not Thursday, not this week, but at the end of next week, so in 2 weeks, okay, you can see that right around the 18th, we'll have a draft due and a revision due just after the start of October. So the analysis writing assignment asks you to critically review a print or other media advertisement in order to examine its rhetorical elements. So you can use a video, you could use an ad campaign, you could use a theatrical trailer. Any of those would be good options. So what you want to do is compose an essay that describes the ad in question. More specifically, I'm going to suggest that you explain the ad and its message very generally, number 1. Number 2, what are its purpose and implications? Why does it exist? Give us some context for the ad. Who is its ideal audience? Number 3. Okay. Then once you've identified those elements, the context, the audience, and you create a description of the ad itself, I want you to comment on the visual content. That's your 4th criteria. And lastly, just explore whether you believe it to be effective or ineffective advertising. The content and the organization of the essay, of course, will depend on the individual advertisement you select and the elements you clarify and the support that you bring to your argument. I would ask, just as a reminder, that since we might potentially be peer reviewing these ads, please don't select something that has objectionable language or visuals, because you don't want to run the risk of offending a fellow student. And when I say objectionable, I mean crude, like glaringly crude or vulgar. Okay. It's all right if you have something that's a little controversial, but try to keep things, like let's say PG for right now. If your grandma didn't want to see it or discuss it with you, you might want to think twice about using that as your example. Now, to further emphasize how you might pull this off, or how you might go about completing this assignment, on your homepage, I have posted under the Content tab an example let's see here, rhetorical analysis. Yep. Of the original poster for The Princess Bride and the theatrical preview or the trailer for The Princess Bride. So if you wanted to use either of those and create sort of a theme for your exercises this semester, you have links that you can follow to do that very thing. All right. That's about it for me for today. Don't forget that on page 94, the bottom of page 94, the top of page 95, okay, here's the bottom and the top of 95. You have this really nice little checklist that creates another opportunity for you to design a potential outline for how you want to construct your paper this semester. You could do much worse than follow this checklist in creating an outline to prepare yourself for that assignment. Last but not least, we're officially into September. So that means we have about 2 weeks for you to order your copy of The Princess Bride if you haven't done so already, or find access to one of those. So please make sure that you are active in doing that so that you will be able to jump into the conversation when we begin to discuss that primary text. Okay, that's a lot, I know. But if you have questions or concerns, or you just need some clarification after watching this video, as always, email me. Otherwise, we'll see you for installment number 2 this Thursday. Take care, everyone.